In the public consciousness, the origin of communism seems like a simple, almost linear story. It is a story about one man, Karl Marx, who, sitting in the library of the British Museum, invented a theory, and then, decades later, a group of radicals in Russia brought it to life, changing the course of 20th century history. Popular textbooks and political discussions often reduce this complex process to the intellectual biography of a single philosopher and the political ambition of a few revolutionaries. But this view is fundamentally flawed. It ignores the main point. Ideas are not born in a vacuum. Marx did not invent the specter that was haunting Europe. He merely gave it a name and a language. The true origin of communism lies not in texts, but in the tectonic shifts of human civilization itself. Communism was a response to the most radical transformation in history since the invention of agriculture, the Industrial Revolution. And it was born in the roar of the first steam-powered looms, in the unbearable stench of the Manchester slums, in the despair of people turned into mere appendages of machines. Communism is not just an ideology, it is the burn scar of capitalism. Today, we will step outside the boundaries of Marx's biography. We will walk the path that Europe itself walked, from the coal mines and the barricades of 1848 to the trenches of World War I. We will understand how the combination of industrialization, extreme poverty, global war, and the collapse of one of the world's oldest empires created the perfect storm. And we will see why communism became an inevitable byproduct of the Western capitalist world, long before it ever triumphed in Russia. This is the story of what historians often overlook when trying to simplify the complexity of the past. This is the story of the true birth of communism. To understand the origin of communism, we must take a journey into the past, to early 19th century Europe, and smell the scent of that era. It was the smell of coal, sewage, and fear. By the 1840s, Great Britain, followed by France and Germany, was experiencing an industrial boom. The invention of the steam engine destroyed the old agrarian world, where human life was dictated by the changing of the season. Now, life was dictated by the factory whistle. This new world promised incredible wealth, and it did create it, but only for the few. For those who owned the factories and the mines, the bourgeoisie. For the vast majority, a new class that came to be known as the proletariat, this world became a living hell. Historians often speak of the economic growth of that time, but they rarely focus on the true cost of that growth. The price was monstrous. People driven from their lands by enclosure laws flocked to the cities with nothing but their ability to labor. There, 14-hour work shifts with no days off awaited them. The complete absence of safety regulations meant that losing an arm or a leg on the factory floor was commonplace, leading to immediate dismissal and starvation. There were no pensions, no sick leave, no labor laws whatsoever. But the most terrifying aspect was the plight of children. Child labor was not an invention of the 19th century, but industrialization gave it an industrial scale. Small children worked in mines, crawling through narrow tunnels where adults could not fit, or cleaned the moving parts of active machinery, risking being crushed. Their lives were short, and their suffering was endless. Mortality rates in working-class neighborhoods were astronomical. The average life expectancy of a laborer did not exceed 30 years. They lived in slums where multiple families might cram into a single room, devoid of clean water and sanitation. Cholera and typhus were constant companions in their lives. It was this state of absolute, bleak despair that became the breeding ground for radical ideas. Traditional explanations for poverty, the will of God, or human laziness no longer worked on the factory floors where people worked to the point of exhaustion, creating wealth they could never access. The working class began to realize itself as a single entity, as a class that had nothing to lose but its collective change. They did not need Marx to understand that the system was deeply unfair. They needed a language to articulate this injustice and a roadmap to change it. It is at this moment that Karl Marx steps onto the stage. Popular history views him as the inventor of communism, but this is a distortion. It is far more accurate to view him as a great diagnostician. Marx did not invent the problems of capitalism. He was simply the first to subject them to fundamental scientific analysis. His genius lay not in crafting a utopia, but in deconstructing reality. When Marx and his friend and collaborator Friedrich Engels, the son of a wealthy factory owner who saw the poverty of Manchester with his own eyes, began to write, Socialist ideas already existed. There were utopians like Robert Owen who tried to create ideal communities, or Charles Fourier with his phalansteries. But their ideas were based on a moral appeal to the goodwill of the rich. Marx utterly rejected this approach. In 1848, just weeks before revolution swept across Europe, Marx and Engels published a short pamphlet titled The Communist Manifesto. In it, they did something truly revolutionary. They moved socialism out of the realm of morality and into the realm of history and economics. Using a method called dialectical materialism, Marx declared that the history of humanity is not a history of ideas or great heroes, but a history of class struggle over the control of material resources. Marx did not merely criticize capitalism for its cruelty. He acknowledged its incredibly progressive role. Capitalism had destroyed feudalism, created a global market, and advanced technology more than all previous generations combined. But according to Marx, capitalism contained the seeds of its own destruction. It had created the very class that would ultimately destroy it, the proletariat. Marx's central idea was remarkably simple. The bourgeoisie owns the means of production, like the factories, while the workers own nothing but their labor. Capitalists pay workers only the bare minimum required for survival, appropriating the surplus value, the real wealth created by the workers' labor for themselves. This fundamental contradiction, according to Marx, could never be resolved through peaceful reforms. The system could only be broken. Communism, a society without classes, without private property, and without a state, was presented by Marx not as a distant dream, but as the inevitable next stage of historical development. Marx did not invent communism. He claimed to have discovered the scientific law of its inevitable arrival. He gave the working class not just hope, but a profound sense of historical mission. In that same year of 1848, when the manifesto was published, Europe was shaken by a series of uprisings known as the Spring of Nations. From Paris to Vienna, from Berlin to Milan, people took to the streets. These were complex revolutions, blending demands for democracy, national liberation, and social equality. But for the first time in history, the working class emerged as an independent, terrifying force. In Paris, workers, angry that the revolution which overthrew the king had given them no social rights, launched an uprising. They demanded the right to work and the creation of social workshops. For several days, brutal battles raged in the streets of the city. The new Republican government, terrified by the prospect of a socialist revolution, deployed the army. Thousands of workers were killed on the barricades, and tens of thousands were arrested and exiled to penal colonies. The revolutions of 1848 were ultimately defeated across Europe. Old monarchical regimes returned to power, or authoritarian dictatorships were established, like that of Napoleon III in France. For Marx and his followers, this was a cruel but vital lesson. This widespread defeat proved two things to them. First, that the liberal bourgeoisie, who had also fought against the monarchs, feared the working class much more than they feared kings, and would betray the workers at the decisive moment. Second, that the state apparatus, the army, the police, the courts, were not neutral entities. They were weapons wielded by the ruling class. It was impossible to simply capture the state through peaceful reforms. The working class had to completely smash this machine through violent revolution and establish its own power. This would be the dictatorship of the proletariat, a temporary stage on the road to pure communism. The failure of the 1848 revolutions cemented the radical nature of communism, transforming it from a philosophical theory into a manual for revolutionary war. The failure of reform became the ultimate advertisement for revolution. Decades passed, and capitalism adapted. The standard of living in Europe began to slowly rise, and the first trade unions and social democratic parties emerged, fighting for reforms from within the system. Marx's ideas began to seem outdated, and violent revolution looked like a distant, unlikely prospect. But in 1914, Europe committed collective suicide. World War I began. This war is often described as a conflict of empires, a struggle for territories and global markets. But for the origin of communism, it holds a different, far more profound significance. This war was the first truly industrial conflict in human history. It was a war in which the technologies created by capitalism were repurposed for the industrial slaughter of human beings. Tanks, aviation, poison gas, machine guns. These were all products of the very same factories that had created the proletariat. World War I destroyed the very legitimacy of the old European order. Millions of workers dressed in military uniforms were sent into the trenches to kill each other for interests they had absolutely no stake in. The war demanded the total mobilization of the home front, turning factories into military arsenals where working conditions once again became unbearable. The core argument of the communists, that capitalism inevitably leads to destruction and that the workers have no true fatherland, suddenly became a harsh reality for millions. The war clearly demonstrated that national borders were merely conventions, masking a shared global system of exploitation. On the barricades of 1848, hundreds had stood. In the trenches of 1914, millions sat in the mud. This war fully militarized the working class and stripped them of their fear of violence. It proved beyond a doubt that a system capable of such mass murder for profit simply had no right to exist. World War I made revolution not just a possibility. In the eyes of many, it made it an absolute necessity. It created the exact conditions under which the phrase, war to the palaces, peace to the huts, ceased to be a radical slogan and became the last remaining hope for millions. At the beginning of the 20th century, Marx and most socialists expected that the socialist revolution would occur in the advanced industrial nations, Great Britain, Germany, or France. They expected it where capitalism had reached its absolute peak. Almost no one expected it to happen in Russia. The Russian Empire was a backward, agrarian country, where 80% of the population were illiterate peasants, living in conditions that barely differed from the Middle Ages. Industrialization in Russia began late, but it was incredibly rapid and highly concentrated. It created massive factories with a deeply radicalized working class in just a few major cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow. Russia was exactly what Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the Bolsheviks, would later call the weak link in the imperialist chain. All possible historical contradictions converged there simultaneously. Archaic absolutism, archaic peasant land ownership, modern factory capitalism, and the brutal oppression of numerous ethnic minorities. The 1905 revolution, though violently suppressed, had already exposed the extreme fragility of the system. World War I delivered the fatal blow to the Russian Empire. The country's economy simply collapsed under the crushing weight of total war. The front lines disintegrated, and the army, consisting mostly of peasants who had no idea what they were dying for, began to desert en masse. Famine struck the cities due to the complete paralysis of the transportation network. The corruption and sheer incompetence of the Tsar's government reached astronomical proportions. Tsar Nicholas II lost all authority, not just among the common people, but among the elite as well. A unique situation emerged in Russia. The state was actively crumbling under the weight of its own backwardness in the war, creating a massive political vacuum. The country was a powder keg, and the World War was the lit match brought right to the fuse. In this absolute chaos, only one political force actually knew what to do. The Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, were not the inventors of the people's discontent. They were master organizers and strategists. Unlike Western socialists who had chosen the slow path of democratic reform, Lenin had created a new type of party. And it was a ruthless, highly disciplined organization of professional revolutionaries. Lenin realized that in Russia's unique conditions, there was no need to wait for capitalism to fully develop. A revolution could win by uniting the radical urban working class with the massive peasant majority, who were desperately starving for land. The Bolsheviks offered the exact, simple, clear slogans that the exhausted nation needed. Peace to the peoples, land to the peasants, factories to the workers. In February 1917, under the immense pressure of mass protests in Petrograd, the monarchy completely collapsed. The provisional government that took power attempted to establish a liberal democracy, but it made one fatal error. It decided to continue fighting the war. This single decision sealed its fate. The country accelerated its descent into total anarchy. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks finally struck. What would later be glorified as the Great October Socialist Revolution was in reality a brilliantly organized military coup. They seized power in a country where central authority had effectively ceased to exist. Armed detachments of the Red Guard quickly captured key points in Petrograd, the telegraph office, the train stations, the bridges. With almost no resistance, they took the Winter Palace, where the provisional government was hiding. At the All-Russian Congress of Soviets, Lenin proclaimed the transfer of all power to the Soviets of workers, soldiers, and peasants' deputies. The very first decrees of the new Soviet power were the Decree on Peace, offering an immediate exit from the war, and the Decree on Land, which nationalized elite estates and handed the land over to the peasants. These immediate actions secured the support of millions for the Bolshevik cause. The revolution in Russia was not just a change of government, it was the practical realization of ideas that had haunted Europe for decades. It was the precise moment when Marx's abstract theory transformed into concrete state policy. It was the moment the specter of communism finally gained flesh and blood. The Bolshevik victory in Russia became possible not because Marx's ideas were flawless, but because the reality of early 20th century capitalism had become unbearable, and the old system of power had completely shattered. The Russian Empire did not fall by Lenin's hand. It fell from its own inability to adapt to the industrial world and modern total war. The Bolsheviks simply picked up the power that was left lying in the mud. Historians often make a critical mistake when they try to find a single, isolated source for communism. Communism was not invented in the quiet study of a philosopher. It was forged in the roaring halls of industrial giants. Marx merely provided a voice for the suffering of millions. Communism was not artificially imposed on Russia by a small group of conspirators. It was the ultimate response to the systemic collapse of a society destroyed by its own backwardness and an industrial war. The true origin of communism is the story of how civilization itself birthed the very force destined to destroy it. Industrialization created not only unprecedented wealth, but also unprecedented grinding poverty. It created a massive class of people who had absolutely nothing in common except their shared pain. The year 1848 cemented the idea that this brutal system could never be changed through peaceful reforms. World War I militarized this oppressed class and permanently stripped them of their fear of death and violence. And the collapse of the Russian Empire created a unique, massive power vacuum. This vacuum was filled by a party possessing an iron will, fully prepared to bring theoretical bloodshed into reality. October 1917 changed the world forever, opening a new era of ideological battles that would define the entire 20th century. But the roots of these monumental events lie much deeper than mere political ambition. They lie deep in the very essence of modernization, in the dramatic, violent collision between new technology and human life. When as long as our modern world continues to grapple with extreme inequality and systemic crises, that old specter will continue to haunt us. It serves as a constant reminder that the ideas Marx once diagnosed are not born in dusty books, but in the harsh reality in which people are forced to live. Understanding this true origin of communism is not just an academic history lesson. It is the absolute key to understanding the deep contradictions of our very own time.